SFU City Conversations is presented by SFU Public Square. Oh, it's outside. We want to thank our sponsors, SFU Vancouver, the Center for Dialogue, and the SFU City Program. We would like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on unceded traditional Coast Salish territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And anybody here for the first time at the City Conversation? Raise your hand. Okay, great. Formal looking lecture room, right? But despite the look of this room, we don't have speakers and we don't have an audience. We have presenters and we have participants. You are the participants. Right? The presenters are going to take just a few minutes each to briefly frame the conversation, to frame the topic. But most of the time is devoted to your questions, your observations, not just questions. It's not just, you ask a question and then they give you an answer. But your observations, your opinions, your thoughts about what you are hearing today, because the real focus is for all of you. Right? Anybody brought their lunch? Thank you so much for doing so. It is not rude to eat your lunch at City Conversations. If you are eating, it's #CityCon. And if you aren't on our mailing list, there will be a list circulating. And please sign up. We'll send you an email for each event. Our events are normally on the first and third Thursday of each month, except December and the beginning of January is no use at that time. Right? We're all off with family. Today we're going to talk about the power of a riot, justice, identity, and belonging. I think all of you will remember the 2011 Stanley Cup riots. They were described as the largest crime spree in Vancouver. I'm not sure that that's true. Historically, we did have the riots against Chinese and Japanese, and actually a couple of others as well. But it was certainly massive, and it was transformational for Vancouver. The next morning, following the riot, hundreds of people took to the streets to reclaim our city. That summer, Professor Steve Reichert was writing about similar riots in England. He's a social psychologist at the University of St. Andrews who studies crowd actions, political rhetoric, and national identity. He's visiting Vancouver today. And so 5 years after the Stanley Cup riots, what have we learned? So we want to welcome Professor Reichert. Joining him is Tanya, have difficulty, Arvanitidis. Did I get it? Arvanitidis, sorry. She's a PhD candidate at SFU School of Criminology. She's been studying the riots since 2011. And John DeHaas is board member of the Vancouver Association for Restorative Justice. That's right. All of you.
Well, I've been studying riots since the 2nd of April 1980. I'm doing my PhD in Bristol, in the west, the southwest of England, when the people of St. Paul's were kind enough to provide me with some data for my studies. And since then, I remain fascinated by crowds and by riots. Although one of the problems in equating the two is that actually crowd violence is incredibly rare. It's just that if you, say, had 100 games of football on a Saturday afternoon and there were riots at one, that's the one you would see and you would ignore the other 99. So by, if you like, exposure, we tend to conflate crowds and violence. And the assumption that crowds are violent leads us to react towards crowds in ways that can be counterproductive. But the point I want to make is this. When riots first occur, the overwhelming response is not about understanding them, it's about managing the politics of blame. It's in particular about government saying we are not to blame, because the first responsibility of any government is to assure the social order. That's why government is legitimate. It creates a context of order in which we can live our daily lives. So it is catastrophic for any government to admit that they are either directly or indirectly responsible. Which leads to a whole series of narratives which aim to stop explanation. One is to come up with explanations which aren't explanations. The notion that crowds are criminal. Now, as a description, that's perfectly reasonable. To riot, to take part in a riot, is a criminal act. That's a description, it's not an explanation. To explain a riot as a result of the criminality of the individuals is entirely different. But to give the illusion that you're explaining something when you're not is a huge problem. Or else there is a use of what one might call moral terrorism to avoid explanation. It's the notion that you've got to condemn. You've got to start off by condemning, and if you explain, you are explaining away. This notion that if you say, actually let's try and understand why people act the way they're acting, you are condoning, is used to try and stop people coming to terms with things. Now, I always find that an odd argument. I, like many social psychologists, am of Jewish background. Social psychology, its major question has always been discrimination and inequality coming out of the Holocaust. As a Jew, and like many other Jews, am I seeking to explain away the Holocaust by explaining it? Am I trying to explain away discrimination by trying to understand it? In the same way, am I trying to explain away riots by trying to understand them? So I want to argue that the first problem we have is we have a politics of blame and attribution of blame. We don't have explanations. We lack explanations. Now, in coming here, I read two of the reports, the Vancouver Police Report and the Independent Report. And they're, in many ways, impressive documents, and in many ways, the policing of the riot was very impressive. However, there are a couple of things that strike me about these reports. And the first is the fact that they presuppose they have an explanation when they don't. The question in the Independent Report on the first page, the question then is not the cause of the riot. Troublemakers deliberately caused it for the conditions that gave them the opportunity. The key ingredients were congestion and free-flowing alcohol. So we are told, it's an old story, but basically we have a particular demographic, young men, who are drunk, and that explains things. But when you go through the report, actually you find that cannot stand up. Why can't it stand up? Well, first of all, you've had plenty of other events with young men and with lots of alcohol where there have not been riots. Number two, even during this event, there were people watching the game in Surrey, which I was told coming here, has got a very high crime rate, and yet there weren't riots there. So just talking about the demographic and talking about alcohol explains nothing. The second reason why is that actually when you look closely, you're talking about a relationship between different groupings. Some people who instigated violence, some people who joined in, some people who watched and made it harder for the police to deal with the situation. The key question then is, what is the relationship between the three groups? Why did people who didn't come for violence join in? In other events, like during the Olympics, those other people did not side or condone the violence, they acted against it and they didn't stop it. So why were the relationships different here? And it seems to me that the answer to those questions depend upon something that is also missing in here. 396 pages, incredibly detailed, not a single voice from the rioters, not a single voice, not a single testimony. We have no understanding of their perspective, their reality. Now, Martin Luther King once said that riots are the voice of the unheard. And we tend to condone that when they're riots that we quite, in retrospect, approve of, the riots of the oppressed against their oppression. But the same applies, I think, in all riots. If you want to understand a riot, look at it in detail, look at it happen, listen to the voice of the participant, and only if you do that will you come to understand what they were doing and therefore be in a position to deal with it more effectively in the future. We don't have an explanation, and the first step towards building an explanation is to acknowledge that freely and to acknowledge that what we have has stood in the way of explanation.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, next up is Tanya Arvanitidis. I got it?
Yes, you got it, thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so I'm Tanya, I'm a PhD student in criminology, and I studied two things. I've been studying two things for the past 6 years or so. The first one is, as mentioned, the Stanley Cup riot that took place in 2011, and the second thing I study is restorative justice, because I think that there is a place for restorative justice in the aftermath of the riot. And even now, 5 years later, I still think there's a place for restorative justice. And when I had that opinion, before I got a lot of criticism for it, I still might get some criticism for it, but I do think there's a place for restorative justice after riots, even as destructive as the 2011 riot, and that's because a lot of my research on the riot has looked at social identity and how important, our identity as Vancouverites was after the riot, and a lot of the research has suggested that a lot of the response that followed the riot, both from the criminal justice system but also from individual people, was an attempt to rebuild our identities, because the riot was enormously destructive in that aspect. And that's something that I think has also been missing from the conversation that I found really interesting. So in criminology, when we talk about victims, we usually talk about direct victims. So you were the victim of a robbery or the victim of an assault or something. There's a direct physical or material harm. Something that was witnessed after the riot that I found very interesting was that there were a lot of people who, despite having suffered no, direct identifiable harm, people who were not even downtown when the riot took place were still acting as though they had been victimized. They were really angry about the riot, and they took it really personally. And so I had the privilege to be able to work with a data set that was actually compiled by Chris Schneider, who is working. He was a professor at UBC, he's in Ontario now, but I think at University, he's overloaded. But he had a data set of one of the Facebook groups that was set up in the aftermath of the riot for the purpose of basically naming and shaming participants in the riot. So this was kind of a form of online vigilante justice, where people in Vancouver who had been downtown the night of the riot, who had photos and video evidence of people taking part in the riot, somebody started a Facebook group where they encouraged people to upload photos. We're going to identify these people and we're going to bring them to justice. And the stated purpose of the group was to assist the BPD in their investigative efforts. But as the group continued, it became really clear that it was more than just this. It was more than just this kind of operational purpose. There was kind of a cathartic, symbolic purpose to the group, which was just to publicly air our anger and our frustration at these people, and to publicly shame them on this public group that everybody can see. So looking at this group and looking at all of the posts that were compiled from this group, Chris Schneider, studying this, saw this pattern, and then looking at it, I also saw this pattern where the language that people were using to describe the event and to describe the rioters specifically was really, really laden with considerations of identity. People saying, these people have shamed our city, they have shamed us as Vancouver, they've shamed us as Canada. And then this really interesting thing happened where people were using language basically to other the rioters, and they were using words that you probably, if you were around in the riot, you've heard these terms, which are kind of funny in that they're really meaningful but simultaneously sort of meaningless, where they were saying, these people are not the real Vancouver, and they're not real hockey fans, which literally does not make a lot of sense, because they were downtown watching the hockey game, and they're in Vancouver, but it was very important to people to be able to do this, to say, no, we're not the real Vancouver, we're the real Vancouver. They're not real hockey fans, we're real hockey fans. And so social identity theory is too much to get into here, but it's kind of this notion that we, our identities are based in large part by the groups that we identify with, which can be kind of physical groups or kind of more symbolic groups. But there's also this related concept of social identity threat, which is when somebody threatens the status of the group that we belong to. It's a whole bunch of coping mechanisms that we then engage in to try to fight back against that threat. So this was a really interesting kind of case study of that happening, where these people kind of sabotaged our reputation as members of this Vancouver community. So we're going to create a new group. We're going to create, you know, real Vancouver, real hockey fans. These people are not part of that group. Since I'm running out of time, I'll bring this back to restorative justice by saying, for those who are not familiar with restorative justice, it's a form of justice where that basically focuses on rehabilitating the offender through basically reconciling or repairing the harms that are done between victims and offenders, and in this case, victims and their communities. Part of the punitive response that followed the riot was, I think, fueled in large part by the symbolism behind it. It was so important for us to be able to other these people who took part in the riot, to be able to justify the punishment against them by saying they're not like us, they're not the real Vancouver. But restorative justice gives us a really important opportunity not just to repair the harms that occurred after the riot, but to also recognize our common humanity, which is a really difficult task, and one that a lot of people are understandably defensive against. But I do think there's room to have this conversation about maybe these people are not so different from us after all. Maybe there is actually room to recognize how we are actually part of the same community. There is no real Vancouver and fake Vancouver. There's just, we're all Vancouver, and you know, we're all part of the same community. It's a lot of work to repair that harm and to reconcile those differences, but I think it's possible, and it's a slightly contentious topic, I understand, but I guess I'll end the conversation there.
Thank you. John DeHaas.
Thank you. Great to be here. I was sort of asked as speaker, I just realized there's a tremendous value to look back from a 5-year perspective. And some of the questions that came up for me was overall, what was the damage, not just of that event, but since then as well. Who's really harmed, what's been restored, what have we learned? And to me, the first part was really the planning for the event. I think we all understood, when you look back at it, that it would be a significant event for Vancouver. There could be different outcomes. You can win, you can lose, whatever. And that the planners, I think, clearly failed. I think you can't look back at that and not come to that conclusion. All of the eventualities weren't sorted out. There just wasn't enough diligence, and who knows why. I'm not blaming. I'm just saying that it's an obvious fact. There might have been erroneous assumptions built on the games. I don't know. And there were undoubtedly conversations in the background. But I think the harm that was done to me when I look back is the reaction to the suggestion that enough planning wasn't done. And I'm sure there was some shame around that by the planners, and a desire not to be held responsible or accountable. And so it really did manifest into anger. And I think the breach of trust, when we look back, was when we have people who are planning for an event, and perhaps it goes sideways, that they take responsibility, and we can all understand when they say, you know, we made wrong assumptions, and they act in a sophisticated manner, rather than react with blame at the rioters, and don't do any inquiry. It was really to say, it didn't go right, we need to inquire. To me, that was a tearing of our social fabric, because our belief in our planners is that they will admit error and move forward. The riot itself, I don't think, needs much discussion, in the sense that people who participated did breach the social contract. We all know there would be alcohol, excitement, a bit of mayhem, but it went to the point of offending the public. So that, I think, takes care of itself. But what we did afterwards speaks a lot to who we are and what we are as a society. And the anger, blame, and the desire for retribution, which started, quite frankly, from the Premier's office down, seemed to be unsophisticated. It didn't seem to have a goal in sight. What was the goal? And the goal really is is about restoring our society, having us as citizens feeling that whatever went wrong would be handled in a way that would repair the social fabric. And we've heard some of the ways that it went. And to me, that leaves me feeling that the social order has not been restored yet. And I'm not sure it ever will be, it may just carry on. But I think somewhere in our subconsciouses, we have a sense of the planners didn't own up. The rioters did wrong, but they are people. And we know they all had something different about those different things. But the acceptance back of those who made errors, the young people who had too much alcohol and acted in a way that they need to atone for, were never treated as members of our community who should be given the opportunity to restore their relationship with us, and that would make me feel better. So I think we're left with the social fabric really still quite torn, and I'm not sure if we're much wiser. I mean, in terms of learning, my learning is that we haven't yet changed our perspective. We are still quick to blame rather than to be more accepting and open-minded, which comes from true strength. And we haven't yet brought in things like restorative justice that actually provide the opportunity for the victims to be heard, for the offenders to think about what they've done and make amends. And I know there's been a lot of damage. We know there's sort of the iconic one was the family, I believe it was in Langley, the young man on the front car of the province, lighting a rag to burn a police car, whose family, as I understand it, no longer live in the Lower Mainland. And that was a young man who the next day realized what he's done, and from his heart wanted to make amends. And nothing would be more powerful in our society than to provide the opportunity for him to act in that way. I would feel better if I see those folks who have done wrong repair that visibly, openly, and then we would accept them back. So I think there's restorative work that was never done, and I'm not sure now 5 years later will be done, but it could be a very powerful lesson for future events.
Great. A lot to chew on. And now it's your opportunity to chew. So, let's get started. Ask questions, make observations, offer opinions, your opinions, which may differ. It's okay. That's what this is about. It's a conversation. Please give us your full name, raise your hand when you want to talk, and I'll try to pick up on themes as I hear so that we aren't just scattershotting over different topics. We'll try to follow one topic as far as you want to take. I saw a hand in the back. Yes, sir.
David Moyer, and I come from a law enforcement background, so this is for Professor Riker. You studied this riot through documents and that, and you made this a purpose in life in a sense. From your understanding of what happened here in Vancouver, were the essential ingredients for causing a riot always here, or did it just kind of show up on the night?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is I haven't studied this riot, and I don't think the work has been done to allow us to answer those questions. One of the things I will occasionally say, it's terrible to be called an expert, because people think you can explain everything. And I will often say, I'm a little bit like a doctor, okay? I can talk in general terms to you about a disease, but I can't diagnose a patient who I haven't examined. And what the media will often want, very quickly after any riot, they will say, why did it happen? And the answer is, and everybody's answer should be, I don't know. Because I don't know what the phenomenon is. So how can I explain it without understanding it? Now, again, I come back to the fact that often the most valuable resource you have when understanding a riot is to look in detail about what was done and why people did what they did. It's often said that in riots, people behave in terms of their understandings of the world. Okay? And what they do reveal those understandings. And if you want to deal with those understandings, you need to access them and have understanding of. The notion that the crowds are somehow this irrational explosion or ultimately meaningless throws away this incredible diagnostic resource. So I suppose what I'm saying is precisely that study needs to be done in order to understand why people did what they did, and in order to be able to deal with it in the future. Let me offer one possibility. I'm not offering this as this is the truth, it's a question. I'm at the stage where I can ask questions, I can't give you answers. One of the issues that is really interesting to me if we talk about identity is about space and identity. Because all spaces relate to identities. They say who belongs and who doesn't belong. And often we have found in a number of cities there is an attempt to, if you like, create an elite space, to gentrify space, to make space give status to a particular city, which means that particular people don't belong. Particular people are seen as unsightly. We no longer want, rough-looking people. We no longer want people drinking in public. They are excluded from that particular space. Now, to what extent was that important in this particular riot? Was there an element whereby people felt they were in a space from which they were excluded, that when they occupied that space, they were seen as a threat? When there was an attempt to push them out of that space, it was seen to reproduce those particular issues and those particular inequalities. Was that part and parcel of the reason why some people who hadn't come for violence didn't oppose it when there was opposition and when there were problems? We need to understand those issues, because if that were true, then perhaps a different form of planning, one which welcomed people into that space, one which organised events after the game to say you have a right to be here and to occupy this space, might have led to a very different type of dynamic. As I say, I'm in a position to ask questions about what happened, why it happened, and the meanings of events to people, and therefore why they responded as they did. And until we've looked into that, then arguing about the causes and arguing about the solutions will be based on prejudices and presuppositions rather than based upon evidence.
Okay. Over here, and then in the back, and then there was a question over here. If your comment or your question, your observation flows directly from what you just heard, particularly, let's try to stay on one topic. But go ahead, please.
Thank you. My name's Fred as well. Please, thank you all. I was absolutely overwhelmed myself when the riot happened. I'm in North Vancouver, and I could see the smoke coming up, and I felt that sense of confront that people have talked about. And sorry, speak a little louder. Is that all right? The article that came out in the Sun or the Province within a few days of the riot had a completely different tone than any of the other articles, and it struck deeply to my heart. And the article said, these people are our sons, our brothers, the sons and cousins of our friends. These are the young men that we know. They're part of our society. And what I really wanted to hear from the panel was a way of I've been fascinated about society finding redemption, but to me it was around providing an opportunity for each of the individual sons and cousins to find a way of feeling a sense of redemption themselves for what happened. And I think that is a need that many of them still have. I have been witness in the City Hall event in North Vancouver to young people, young men who had been through the restorative justice process as high school age, and in late high school age getting rewards unbeknownst from the mayor for being really good citizens. And the junction point that happened in between in their life was having an opportunity to speak their voice, apologize, and then be able to move on in a good, fresh, clean way because they felt that sense of redemption. Thank you.
Any response? No. Then, right here.
there is always a language of othering. Okay? When the British riots happened, people were described in all sorts of ways. Sometimes it was explicit. They're outsiders. They're not from our community. You know, they're not true Vancouverites. They're not true Londoners and so on. That was number one. The second was then more pernicious. They are feral youth, right? They are animalistic. They are outside. Right? And unless you do include people within the social, then you're never going to solve these problems. And the more you respond by defining them as other, the more you're going to reproduce those problems. Now, of course, it is important for those who acted and rioted and destroyed things to recognize what they did. Right? But there's an incumbency the other way around. Because, of course, it may be true, the reason why they feel somewhat at odds with society is because indeed they are excluded from society. We do live in an unequal society. We live in a society where people do have unequal access to resources, are seen as more or less fitting within our spaces. So if we are talking about including people in society, we also have to understand, well look, are there real inequalities and exclusions which might be at the root of this, and do we deal with those? Or do we just want a one-sided, we'll have reconciliation, but we'll leave actually the reality of not everybody is fully included? I in fact came here for an event yesterday which was a talk about reconciliation in the context of First Nations people. And as you will know far more than I, but learning about this, the debate about reconciliation with First Nations people makes the distinction between a reconciliation which says, okay, well let's all say sorry and get on, and a reconciliation which truly addresses all the forms of exclusion and all the forms of inequality with First Nations people. Well, reconciliation is exactly the same when it comes to this particular context. It can't be one-sided. It can't just be those who participated saying, I'm sorry for what I did. We have to address the very real issues of inclusion and exclusion and inequality and the forms that takes and what that means in terms of our public spaces and who belongs and who's excluded. And only if it's two-sided will we be able to move forward in that respect. So let's not go for reconciliation at the cost of sweeping under the carpet the underlying factors which might have led to the dynamics of that conflict in the first place.
Just following up on the point you made about space, public space, as well as inclusion, I'm already dealing with the Downtown Vancouver Business Improvement Association, so it was our 60 businesses that were impacted, as well as our downtown as a whole. We represent the 8,000 businesses in downtown core. So needless to say, devastating for us and our members. And we thought a lot about it. In our mind, everything is pre-riot and post-riot, because many things have changed with how public space is accessed, how it's permitted. But I think we thought a lot about that public space and about downtown as a whole. And my take on it is that downtown is not a neighborhood. So if you were in the West End or somewhere where people lived, I believe people would have acted differently. Downtown is a place where people come, and you think of Granville Street, good, bad, or otherwise, and people come and they get drunk and they have fights and then they go back to where they live. It's almost like throwing a house party and you're trashing somebody else's house because you don't live there. It's not your lawn, not your neighborhood. So we've always felt there was something about that downtown is kind of corporate. I don't live there. They can trash it. There isn't really people. It's all about the buildings and kind of commerce. So there was this disconnect about the space where it actually happened.
It's okay because it's not your home. Let's try to follow, that's really interesting. Let's see if we can follow up on that. Any of you?
Well, I think you've got to be cautious when you put that out there as fact, because to me it suggests that you may want to look at how you make it be neighborhood for visitors. So if that's really your perception, then that's something we can work on. But I think we've got to be careful when we blame others, when we find explanations that really are always a reflection of us. What are we doing? So the whole response to the riot, again, is a reflection of us as a society. When we go to other, and we don't go to some mature, I'd say from a position of real strength, of compassion, of understanding, of openness. They were creating the problem. The problem we still have today. People, I know there's victims out there whose voices haven't been heard in their field. And there are participants in the riot who have never had the opportunity. Now, it doesn't speak to them, it speaks to us. Because we haven't provided the conversations, the mechanisms, the maturity and the understanding to create a society that provides those opportunities. That's our burden. So a lot that bothers me about the riot is not the riot, it's us.
Somebody who, to this point, or
The prior point, do you have something, Alana?
To this point,
Yeah, you go.
yes, thanks. My name's Alana Abramson, and I thought that was interesting what you said. I find it fascinating that none of the people involved in the riot were interviewed for these reports. And I have a question about how normal that is. I had the opportunity to speak to several people who participated in many ways in the riot and went through the justice system or went through some other process. And and of course this is anecdotal, but that is exactly what they spoke to. They spoke to the lack of personalization, that they were almost attacking corporate greed and logos and not people. So I think it's really interesting what you're saying there, and not that it makes it right, but in pursuit of explaining why people act in these ways and how they feel more or less a sense of belonging to that space is something that is a huge question mark in this case. And so I guess I'm just wondering what have other reports of riots around the world said? Are people interviewed, or are they routinely excluded from the investigation?
I mean, the first thing is to say, first of all, I think this issue is a really interesting issue, but there's a question of, is it just that everybody feels it's impersonal? Or is it that some people feel more excluded from these spaces, more alienated from these spaces than others? I had some colleagues who were doing some work in a city in Britain which was being cleaned up, which was being gentrified, and then explicitly felt that the things, for instance, the forms of surveillance that were there, the CCTV cameras, they experienced them as saying, you're a problem, we're going to deal with you. Whereas when you took sort of middle-class people looked at those cameras and experienced those cameras as defending us against the other, the dangerous other. So it might just be about the space and it not being home for everyone, or it might be about a space from which you are, normally excluded and you're staking a claim in particular ways. And I hope that those are questions. In terms of your specific question, number one, my point would be that a hell of a lot of the reactions to riots are aimed at specifically denying us listening to those voices. If, as the classic theories put it, people become irrational in crowds, there's no point listening to them, they're mad. Or if you have the notion of, oh, they're all hooligans, then they're morally suspect, they're bad, don't listen to them. So there are many devices to try and stop us listening to those voices. And my point is, whether you agree with them or not, I'm not making a moral judgment about wanting to say they're right. I'm making an analytic judgment. Only if we listen to them can we understand. Now, there are some reports which have attempted to deal with those voices. On the whole, though, that tends to be in terms of riots which are, if you like, riots of inequality, riots around race, ethnicity, and so on, where there is some sympathy to those voices. The impression I get here, and the language is fascinating, it's a universal language which says, we all condemn, they are all wrong, which says those involved in the cleanup are citizens and they don't fall into this category. So I don't think it's, in a sense, I think it is almost a sort of a taken for granted that these people are beyond the pale, so we shouldn't listen to them. Or as I say, you can, but you throw away a very valuable resource if you do so.
very patiently waiting here.
No, this is
and then-
great, thank you. Evelyn Zeller, I'm a criminologist and also a restorative practitioner, so I want to pick up on one of the themes of restorative justice, and you were just talking about listening, and one of the powerful ways to listen to both those who rioted and those who were harmed, of course, is restorative justice. And from my recollection, that was one of the powerful responses in Britain. which was a stark contrast to ours. So we immediately went to total punitive, as John was saying, and Tanya, but in England, that you've studied that allowed a restorative response immediately following very devastating riots.
See, my experience in Britain was actually, no, there wasn't much. I mean, there might have been local projects, but the overall response was the classic response. In fact, actually, I mean, I've now studied waves of riots since 1980. Okay? And it's almost fun if it wasn't so serious. What happens every time is what you do is you say, look, the last riot, yeah, it was about inequality, it was about racism, but this one is different, they're just all hooligans or whatever, because the politics is immediate, right? In the longer term, you can be analytic because you're no longer going to be held accountable for getting it wrong. And that's happened, so in 1985, people say, you know, 1981, that was about social factors, but 1985 was different. And now we say, 1985 was about social factors, but this time it's different. There's exactly the same type of silencing that is going on. There's exactly the same argument that, oh, it's all about criminality, when actually that's a very weak explanation. There's exactly the same notion that they are feral youth and they are outsiders. So I don't think, don't think we've got it any better. In fact, I think we've got it horribly wrong, and I think we're storing up problems for the future by so doing.
Because we look from here with envy going, oh my God, well, England's doing restorative justice, and we're like struggling so much to get through this mess.
Don't look with envy on England.
Not that you did it perfectly, but...
I say that coming from Scotland, which is much better.
In the back, please, and then over here.
Alexandra Haynes. I was just going to ask perhaps a broader question, because some of these riots start off as demonstrations, the poll tax riots. Now you've got demonstration by the Polish women in Poland, again, against the antiquated abortion laws. So I'm really wondering, it's like nobody at the top is really listening at all, because the poll tax riots, the most recent ones, they knew that they had occurred in another century. The Latin, they weren't very popular when they tried to introduce them the first time, and they had riots. So are we ever going to see a demonstration where the government or the people who can make change are going to listen to the common people? Is that going to happen? Because some of the rioters are saying, are justifying rioting on the grounds that, if nobody's listening, we're going to have to make this really violent, maybe they'll listen to us. Kind of like the Black Panthers in their view of things, again, as opposed to Martin Luther King's view of how to handle that.
Okay, well, first of all, I think actually a very good example of listening up is the Polish women's strike. I mean, it was fantastic because within days the government reversed their policy. So if one wants to have optimism about the world, then that's a pretty good place to start. Secondly, we in fact studied the poll tax riot in Britain. And one of the things that really interests me, and in fact I was talking to VPD earlier today about the dynamics of conflict and the conditions under which demonstration leads to riot. So on the whole, demonstration doesn't lead to riot. Okay, as I was saying before, riots are incredibly rare. There was a fantastic book by a woman called Susanna Barrows about crowds in the late 19th century in France, and she shows out of 3,000 public events. There's only conflict in about 1% of them. There's only a death in one of them, and that's used as the norm. The exception is always used as the norm. And when violence happens, I don't have time to go into the dynamics which produce it, but often the assumption that a crowd is dangerous can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, whereby it leads to ways of dealing with crowds which remove rights from crowds, which lead to a sense of illegitimacy, which bring people together who previously weren't united in the crowd in violence. So we need not only to look at the distal factors, we need to look at the proximal dynamics between the crowd and the police, which produce violence. The point is, right, violence is an interaction between two parties. It takes two to tango. And if you try to explain that just by virtue of looking at one of those parties, the crowd, you will never understand those dynamic. Now, I would say that actually, and this was part of our discussion, was I actually think the VPD have been very progressive in understanding that and developing forms of policing which seek to facilitate rather than to repress crowds, and which to seek to limit those forms of violence. For various reasons, and I think they have conflicts, and I think we need to go into them, that didn't happen at the Stanley Cup, and I think there are lessons to learn as a consequence in the way of expanding.
Yes, sir.
Robin Knight. I note in the website advertising this meeting that it says, will the high cost of prosecution be a deterrent? Now, my understanding is that it took 2 years before the first person was brought to justice in Vancouver. Interestingly, in the National Post today, there's an article about slow justice. And it says, 4 months ago, a BC court was still meting out justice for the riots, about 6 years. So, there seems to be, there must be an order of magnitude difference in terms of cost of prosecuting people between London and here. So my question is, would a cheaper and probably a quicker and probably cheaper justice system in bringing people to justice in Vancouver lower the risk of riots? I mean, do rioters have in the back of in the forefront of their mind when they riot are going to be brought to justice? I mean, there's almost a mob rule here, so we're one of many. We've got documents.
A little bit, and then
Lot that's packed into that.
there's so much. There's a lot. So I'm gonna try to be concise. I think it's a really good point. Actually, the BC Ministry of Justice put out a report just in January of this year, which was their prosecution report, and this was something I've been waiting for a long time. Where they talked about this was when I think the final rioters' trials were kind of wrapping up, and so they were able to go over the costs of prosecution and kind of everything that went into it. And, it was an incredibly expensive investigation and an incredibly expensive prosecution. I don't know if it was the most disruptive crime spree in Canada's history, but it was definitely the most expensive investigation in Canada's history. Like completely unprecedented the amount of time and effort and money that went into it. Interestingly, well, I think the damage done by the riot was estimated to be about 3.92 million, and the cost of the prosecution was 5 million, which is really interesting because everybody kind of harps on how destructive the riot was, and the prosecution was over $1 million more expensive. And this went not just into the cost of the justice system, but they actually had to hire out from like the state's analysts and like equipment to analyze photos and to analyze videos, and like they contracted out all these people to come in and do this work. So it was incredibly expensive. And the riot report said had something really interesting. It had this really interesting kind of quote in there, which said that the prosecution costs were necessary for the public interest. So there really is a lot kind of hinging on this idea that we had to do this as a deterrent, but in criminology, deterrence theory, this idea that you can deter crime, I guess it's technically rational choice theory, but this idea that you can deter crime by making the costs of crime high enough, there's very little evidence actually supporting that. This is just kind of, it's an ideology, it's kind of an idea that we like, but there's very little evidence actually showing a relationship between tough on crime and whether people commit crime. So so there's a lot kind of hinging on this idea that we put a lot of work into this. It took years to bring these people to justice, but it's okay because like we deterred them, but we don't actually know that. And so this is I think it's a really big risk that was kind of taken in kind of putting all this work into this, and like really just Vancouver kind of has to hope that they never have another riot ever again, because that's basically what was kind of what the messaging here was. We did all this work, it took 5 years, but it's okay, we will literally never have another riot ever again. Next one that happens is going to be a really interesting conversation, because it's spent $5 million, what happened?
In London, of course, we're sitting the next day after it. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that was an deterrent.
To make a couple of brief comments. A number of years ago, we were doing research on delinquency. We were talking about this. It was a time in the 80s when the Tories wanted to bring in short, sharp shocks against delinquents to make the point, let them really pay And they found that these tough regimes, you know, of having to get up early and go for hikes, actually the kids didn't mind those at all. They made them rather fit and strong and more efficient criminals. What they really couldn't stand and they found difficult was talking about their feelings. That was the hard stuff. So the point is about a restorative model is a restorative model is not a soft model. It's not being soft on crime. Actually, number one, it reintegrates people into the community as opposed to excluding them still further and actually costing us far more because they're criminal. And it's bloody hard work to acknowledge things about yourself and things that you've done which shame yourself. So yes, I think there are alternative models, and this posturing about being hard, hitting people hard, actually it's easy at one level. Restorative justice is efficient and it's hard, but it's worth doing.
Here, and then the gentleman here is limitation, and then here. Yes.
I'm Catherine Bargan, and one of the things I can't help thinking about, or a word that I haven't heard used yet, is scapegoating, and the real primal response we seem to have as human, even violence theory suggests that a lot of, at the root of a lot of violence and our responses to violence is our primal, almost reptilian brain need to scapegoat and to say, there's the problem, put it out in the wilderness to die, now we're fine. And that's incredibly primal and incredibly, drives us as a society, really. And, I can't seem to give up on restorative justice over these last 2 decades, no matter how much evidence continues to be presented to me that nothing's ever going to change. I still continue to seem to want to pursue options in that vein, and I'm wondering if anyone on the panel has thoughts on what it might take for society to rise, to overcome the primal urge as a first response to scapegoat, and because then that first response shapes the politics of the response, which it certainly happened in this case. There's no going back from what was said in those first weeks around, we will bring justice, and that was a scapegoating sort of response. Then there's no going back from that and saying, well, actually, maybe there's a different option, and it seems like that's often perceived as weak. Any thoughts from the panel on how might we as a society move towards where our first response might be like, okay, we didn't like what happened here, but let's hold on, these might be our cousins and brothers, and let's see what might be possible before we go. Any thoughts around how society might shift so that that's a primary response?
Okay.
I can maybe speak to that a bit. I think it kind of comes back to this, again, it kind of comes back to the whole identity thing, this kind of resisting this urge to basically other and to say that people who did this are not like us, they're not. Because even before, we saw this happening on social media and stuff, this was actually reflected in the language that was used, like, as you mentioned, like, it started kind of like high up. It also, you could see it in like media headlines of like news coverage of the riot was saying, thugs and hooligans like trashed our city. It was very much that kind of language. And this is just anecdotal on my part, but I think part of that kind of also has to begin with having a kind of a sense of community in the first place, because I know that my opinion does not reflect everyone's, but this is my opinion as somebody who was not born in Vancouver, somebody who moved to Vancouver to go to school here. And my perception as somebody who has moved here, and also talking to other people who have moved here, is that they don't perceive a very strong sense of community in Vancouver. The sense that I get from people who have moved here is that Vancouver is a profoundly expensive place, and it's a profoundly lonely place, and they find it really hard to connect to people, and then they leave because they can't make this place their home. It's really hard, and so I don't know where that word begins, what part of it could be. Just how do we have that stronger sense of community in the first place, where there is just kind of closer connections between the people who live here. And then the othering thing is very difficult, because I think without having that sense of community, those sense of connections, it is very easy to other people, or to say that people who did this are not like us, people who did this are And that's really, I think that's something that we have to do kind of for our sense of identity, but it's also something that we kind of have to do for ourselves to maintain our kind of self-image, our perceptions of ourselves as good people who would, you know, we would never do anything like this. Like, I'm a good person, I was raised to do right, I would never do anything like this. And a really difficult question, which is really hard to ask, but this is something that in criminology we do look at how so much of crime is unreported. So much of crime is, you know, young people who age out of it, they, you know, become adults and then they become law-abiding. Is this question of, if I was 18 years old, if I was drunk, if I was downtown at the time of the riot, could I have been a part of that riot? And that's really hard. Nobody wants to ask themselves that question because they're like, I definitely would not have been, absolutely not. But if you really think about it, like, could you have been? Like, imagine yourself as a teenager downtown that night. Could you have been a part of it? And once we ask ourselves that question, then the next logical step from there is, oh, maybe the people who were in that riot were not monsters. Maybe they were actually also just people who, you know, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yeah, they made a terrible mistake, but they are people who, you know, but part of that I think kind of starts with a sense of community. It's kind of having that community and, again, my own anecdotal experience.
We only have
Sorry,
a
yeah.
couple minutes left. This gentleman,
I'm not an academic or a politician. I am actually an astronaut. And what doesn't get brought into this, and I like what the panelists said. I have never, and I've been arrested 126 times, 9 convictions. Now, I've been fully pardoned for 29 years, so no fears anybody. Some of my crimes were in downtown court many years ago. I have never committed a crime unless I was high, drunk, or high. What alcohol does is it's an anesthetic, and it anesthetizes the control centers of the brain. And when my brain was anesthetized and the control center, I couldn't control it, which means I couldn't stuff my feelings anymore. They came out. And I didn't belong in school. I was bullied my whole childhood. I didn't belong at home because my family hated my dad because he was a drunk and a Klan member and a crazy guy. And so I didn't belong anywhere. So when I got into prison and on the streets and got connected with criminals, I became part of them. And then there was them over there, and there was us. We have a dualistic society. So the good guys over there and the bad guys over here. Nothing ever gets resolved that way. I've spent years in therapy, recovering, looking at I'm a part of them and I'm a part of us. And there is no real them and us. And so when I saw the riot, I thought, the first thing I thought of is, okay, people say, oh, they're a bunch of drunken hooligans. Well, when they're drunk, they've been drinking. What kind of history do they have that's coming out right now? And of course, the crowd will make it feel it because somebody else is doing it. So I was not ever thinking, what if I get caught? I was acting out of my feelings, and I just was hurting. And I would bet if the real honesty came out, that a lot of these people that were in the riots, doing the damage and burning cars and whatever, like John had brought up, the young fellow in the paper, totally, like I have cried my guts out in asking forgiveness for the things I've done. If I would have had a restorative justice process after I tried to burn the grain elevators down when I was 15 or 14 years old, if I would have had to sit there and talk to everybody, and everybody got to ask me what was going on in my life, I probably would not ever have another crime in my life. And that's what I'm talking about. That's why I believe in restorative justice as well.
well, up promptly at 1:30. Thank you very much for talking about this and sharing this with us. I want to thank our presenters, and I hope you will join me in thanking all of them. We have some gifts of Vancouver Penny. Take back this. Our next conversation next Thursday is a biggie, and we're going to be in the big room 4 in room 1900. You'll have the opportunity to meet Gil Kelly. He is Vancouver's new Director of Planning. It has been a difficult time in planning for Vancouver for about the last 3 or 4 years. A new man here from San Francisco, where he was Assistant Director of Planning in San Francisco. He was before that, the Director of Planning in Portland and Berkeley, California. He's used to conflict, and he has very, very interesting perspectives that he brings to our city. So if you can join us next Thursday on November 3rd, we look forward to it. Thank you all for coming.